Have you ever wondered why the quiet feels so loud after retirement? Why even when the house is still, your mind keeps wandering back to old achievements, old regrets, old dreams you meant to chase but never did? Have you ever asked yourself, is this all there is now? Or even more haunting, who am I without all the things I used to do, used to be, used to chase? What if the peace you've been longing for isn't waiting somewhere, out there in a new project, or in some future version of yourself, but is already here, right where you are, hidden inside the simple, fleeting beauty of this moment? In this story, we walk with Robert, a man just like so many of us, as he learns the gentle art of letting go, of making peace with aging, and of finding joy in the small, quiet places we often overlook. Stay with us, because by the end, you may discover that the life you've been searching for has been quietly waiting for you to come home to yourself. It was a morning like any other, and yet for Robert it felt entirely unfamiliar. The sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting soft golden lines across the worn wooden table. His coffee sat cooling beside him, the steam curling away like a quiet exhale. Outside, the neighborhood stirred to life. Garbage trucks rumbled down the street. Birds chattered in the old oak tree. A neighbor jogged past with a golden retriever pulling eagerly at its leash. And yet inside, Robert sat still, hands wrapped around his mug, eyes unfocused, the quiet wrapping itself around him like a second skin. He was 67, retired, comfortable, as they say. He had spent 4 decades working as an engineer, raising 3 children, building a home, paying the bills, showing up, always showing up. And now there was no alarm clock, no meetings, no project deadline, no late-night emails to answer or early flights to catch. He thought retirement would feel like freedom, and in some ways it did. But on this particular morning, as he watched the sunlight dance across the table, Robert felt something tugging at him just beneath the surface. A quiet question he hadn't known how to name. What now? The strange thing, Robert realized, was that no one talked about this part. People talked about money, about saving enough, about pensions, Medicare, downsizing, travel plans, hobbies. But no one told him about the sudden absence of purpose. No one told him how it would feel to no longer be needed in the same way, to no longer wake up with a full calendar, to no longer be asked to fix, build, solve, manage, direct, provide. He loved his wife, adored his grandkids, enjoyed his friends, but inside there was this quiet, persistent ache. Not depression, not sadness, an ache for meaning. Buddhist wisdom teaches that all human beings carry what's called a dukkha, a restlessness, a dissatisfaction woven into the very fabric of life. It's not a flaw. It's not a personal failure. It's simply the nature of a human heart that longs for something lasting, something real, something that will not crumble with age or fade with time. Robert didn't know this teaching yet, but he was living it. He found himself wandering his own home in the mornings, fingers trailing across the bookshelf, pausing at old photographs, flipping through half-finished crossword puzzles. He tried volunteering at the local food bank, twice. It was good work, important work. But even there, something inside him whispered, "Is this it?" He tried joining a book club, a walking group, a photography class. Each one was pleasant, each one filled an afternoon. And yet, each night as the sun fell and the house grew quiet again, Robert found himself sitting once more at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, staring out the window, feeling that ache rise. What now? What is my life for, if I'm no longer producing, building, providing? Who am I without the role, without the title, without the usefulness? One day, Robert found himself at the town library. Not for any particular reason, just to pass the time. As he wandered the aisles, his eyes caught on a slim book with a gold lotus flower on the cover. The Art of Meaning, Buddhist wisdom for everyday life. He almost put it back. Almost. But something in the title stirred him. That evening, with his reading glasses perched on his nose and the house still wrapped in the hush of night, Robert began to read. Buddhist teachings say this: purpose is not what you do. Purpose is how you show up to life. It is not about filling your calendar or proving your usefulness to the world. It is about turning toward each moment, whether grand or ordinary, with presence, with tenderness, with an open, steady heart. It is not what you achieve. It is what you are willing to meet fully. As Robert read, something inside him softened. He read the story of an old monk who swept the temple courtyard each morning with great care. When asked why he swept with such attention, the monk replied, "Because each leaf is part of the world I love." Robert closed the book and sat still for a long time. He looked around his own home, at the dust on the windowsill, at the flowers in the vase on the table, at the fading light on the walls. For the first time, he wondered, could purpose be found here? In this small, ordinary moment? Over the next days, Robert began experimenting, not with new projects, but with new attention. He made coffee, not as a rushed morning chore, but as a small act of devotion. He called his eldest daughter, not with advice, but simply to listen. He walked to the park and really noticed, the shape of the trees, the sound of the wind, the laughter of children. And as he did, he felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Not excitement, not achievement, not even satisfaction, but peace. A quiet peace that came from meeting his life, not as something to conquer or organize, but as something to receive. One afternoon, as Robert sat again at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across his coffee cup, his wife walked in and paused. "You seem different," she said softly, smiling. Robert looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I think," he said, "I'm learning how to be here." And in that moment he understood something Buddhist wisdom had been whispering to him all along. The greatest purpose after retirement may not be found in reinventing yourself. It may be found in learning how to truly arrive right where you are. As you listen to this story, perhaps you too feel that quiet ache inside you. Perhaps you too are wondering, what now? Perhaps you too are ready to explore a different kind of purpose, the kind that is not measured by achievement, but by presence. Stay with us, because in the next part, we will walk with Robert as he learns to release the "I used to be" story, and we will explore how Buddhist wisdom can help you find freedom beyond identity, beyond roles, beyond the old definitions of success. Together, we will discover that the second half of life is not an ending, but a doorway into the deepest meaning you've been longing for all along. It began with a simple phrase, "I used to be." Robert heard himself saying it more often than he realized. He'd run into an old neighbor at the grocery store, and when they asked how retirement was, he'd laugh softly and say, "Well, I used to be an engineer, you know." It's strange not to have that. At a dinner party, when someone new asked about his life, Robert would find himself glancing down at his wine glass, brushing crumbs from the table, and offering the same refrain. "I used to run a team of 30 people. Big projects, deadlines, budgets." Life was busy back then. At first it seemed harmless, a way of offering context, a shorthand for all the years that had shaped him. But over time, Robert began to notice the weight those words carried. "I used to be" became a shadow, following him from room to room. One morning, as he sat sipping coffee on the porch, Robert overheard a conversation between two children playing next door. "I'm an astronaut," one boy declared proudly. "Well, I'm a dragon," the other shouted, leaping from a low wall, arms spread wide. Robert smiled, listening to their laughter. There was no "I used to be" in their voices, only "I am." And in that moment, something stirred in him, a memory of being young, of playing make-believe, of inhabiting the world with no thought of titles or roles or usefulness. He wondered, when did I start living inside the past tense? When did my life stop being an unfolding and start being a summary? Buddhist wisdom speaks to this very moment in life. It teaches that we carry clinging attachments, not only to people and possessions, but also to identities, roles, stories about who we think we are. We cling to the idea of, "I am successful, I am someone important." And when those identities begin to shift through aging, retirement, illness, or loss, there's a deep kind of grief, a quiet panic that rises up and whispers, "If I am no longer this, then who am I?" Robert had built his life on a foundation of doing. He had been the provider, the fixer, the boss, the helper, the one people turned to when things got messy. Without those roles, without that busyness, he felt like a house with no furniture, empty, echoing, unsure of its own shape. But one afternoon at the town library, Robert stumbled on another passage in the book he had been reading. The self is not a fixed entity, but a flow of conditions. Who you are is not what you were. It is what you bring presence to right now. He sat with those words for a long time. That evening, Robert stood before the bathroom mirror, gazing at his own face. He saw the lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver at his temples, the softness around his jaw. For a long time, he had seen these marks as evidence of decline, as symbols of who he used to be. But tonight, as he looked closer, he wondered if they could mean something else. Maybe they were the marks of who he had become. Not a loss, not a fading, but a ripening. Over the weeks that followed, Robert began an experiment. Each time he caught himself saying, "I used to be," he paused. He took a quiet breath, and then he asked himself, "Who am I, here and now?" Sometimes the answer was simple. "I am someone making coffee." I am someone watching the sunset. I am someone listening to his wife's stories. Sometimes the answer surprised him. I am someone learning to rest. I am someone practicing patience. I am someone discovering small joys. Buddhist teachings call this practice non-self, anatta, the gentle loosening of the rigid story of who we are to make room for something more fluid, more alive. When we stop clinging to old identities, we discover that we are not fixed points. We are moving rivers. We are laughter and tears, grief and grace, silence and song. We are not just the roles we once held. We are the living presence that holds all of it. One day, Robert was sitting on a park bench when an old friend joined him. They spoke of life, of family, of the years rushing past. At one point, the friend asked, "So, how's retirement treating you? Do you miss it?" Robert smiled, feeling the familiar tug in his chest. For a moment, the words, "I used to be," hovered on his tongue. But then, quietly, he said, "You know, I thought I would. But these days I'm just trying to learn how to be here." The friend raised an eyebrow. "Be here?" Robert nodded, smiling softly. "To be where I am as I am without needing to prove anything." And to his surprise, the friend's face softened. "I could use some of that," the friend murmured. Robert walked home that afternoon under a sky streaked with gold and rose, and he realized something beautiful. When you let go of old identities, you make space, not only for yourself, but for others. When you are no longer busy proving your worth, you become a safe harbor for people around you. When you stop performing, you begin to truly connect. Buddhist wisdom teaches that we find our deepest purpose when we no longer need to become someone. Because in the quiet of non-striving, we remember who we have been all along. A heart beating, a breath rising and falling, a presence vast and tender. That evening, Robert stood at the window as dusk settled over the neighborhood. He watched the last light fade behind the trees. He placed a hand gently over his chest, feeling the steady rhythm there. And he whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, "I am here." No more needing to be what he was. No more running to be what he thought he should be. Just this moment, just this breath, just this quiet, luminous being. As we move into the next part of Robert's journey, we'll explore something even more powerful. How impermanence, what we fear most, can become the very doorway to meaning. Stay with us, because what comes next may open your heart in ways you never expected. It was a crisp autumn morning when Robert received the call. His old friend, Mark, a man he had known since college, a man with whom he had shared countless dinners, fishing trips, and slow afternoons, had been taken to the hospital. A heart condition. Unexpected, they said. But isn't it always? Robert sat in the quiet of his kitchen, the phone still resting on the table, his hands folded loosely in his lap. For a long time, he just sat there watching a single leaf tremble outside the window, caught in the breeze. And then slowly, almost without thinking, he rose, took his coat from the hook, and drove to the hospital. Buddhist wisdom teaches that impermanence, anicca, is the fundamental truth of life. Everything changes. Seasons turn. Bodies ache. Friends drift away. Dreams dissolve. Even the mountains, the oceans, the stars Everything dances in the rhythm of becoming and dissolving. But in our ordinary, everyday lives, we resist this truth. We grasp for permanence. We cling to routines, identities, relationships, as if holding tightly will stop them from slipping through our fingers. We build a life around the illusion that things will stay as they are. And then, life taps us on the shoulder. A phone call, a diagnosis, a goodbye we didn't see coming. Suddenly, we are face to face with impermanence. As Robert sat beside Mark's hospital bed, he noticed the frailty in his friend's hands. These were the same hands that had gripped fishing rods on summer mornings, slapped his back in laughter, lifted glasses in countless toasts. Now, they trembled slightly on the white bedsheet, the skin thin and pale. Mark opened his eyes and smiled faintly. "Can you believe it?" he whispered. "All these years. And here we are." Robert smiled back, though his chest tightened. They spoke softly, reminiscing about old memories, weaving together the threads of a shared life. And underneath their words was the quiet knowing they both felt, but did not name. Everything changes. And someday, everything ends. Driving home that evening, Robert felt a strange stillness settle over him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sorrow. Not exactly. It was something deeper, a raw, aching awareness of life's fragility. For the first time he understood, not in theory, but in his bones, that his life was not a fixed possession, but a flowing river. Buddhist wisdom tells us that impermanence is not a tragedy. It is a gift. Because when we understand that nothing lasts, we begin to love more fiercely, to live more fully, to loosen our grip on the things we cannot keep. We stop postponing joy. We stop holding back tenderness. We stop waiting for someday to do what matters most. In the days that followed, Robert found himself moving through the world with new eyes. The old oak tree at the corner of his street, the one he had passed 1,000 times without noticing, suddenly caught his attention. He stood beneath its branches one afternoon, watching the golden leaves drift slowly to the ground. He realized this tree was dying into winter, and it was beautiful. He watched his wife laughing with their granddaughter, her eyes crinkling at the corners, her voice warm and familiar. He realized this moment would pass, and it was precious. He walked through the grocery store, past strangers hurrying through aisles, and he realized every single one of them carried a private world of joys, losses, fears, and all of it was changing, fading, unfolding. That weekend, Robert visited Mark again. They sat in the sunlit hospital room, sipping weak coffee, watching the afternoon light stretch across the wall. Mark turned to him, eyes soft. "You know," he said quietly, "I thought getting old would feel like losing everything." He smiled faintly. "But now, it feels like waking up." Robert nodded, his throat tight, waking up. That was exactly it. Buddhist teachers often describe impermanence as the mirror that shows us what matters. It's not the end of things that breaks us open. It's the awakening to how deeply we have loved. The truth that we will lose everything we cherish is also the truth that allows us to cherish it at all. Back home, Robert began small practices. He took longer walks, noticing the shifting sky. He began keeping a simple gratitude journal. Not to count blessings, but to notice presence, a warm meal, the quiet companionship of his wife, the soft weight of his old dog resting against his feet, the luxury of a quiet afternoon. And in these small, ordinary moments, Robert discovered something astonishing. Meaning was not waiting in some grand project, some late-in-life reinvention. Meaning was here, pulsing through every fleeting second, shimmering inside every goodbye, every sunrise, every breath. One morning, as Robert watched his granddaughter chase bubbles in the yard, he felt tears prick his eyes, not of sadness, of awe. He realized that all the years he had spent chasing stability, success, permanence, he had missed the shimmering beauty of what was right in front of him. He knelt on the grass, opened his arms wide, and laughed as his granddaughter crashed into him in a whirlwind of joy. In that moment, Robert felt more alive than he had in years. Buddhist wisdom teaches us to sit with impermanence, not to overcome it, not to outwit it, but to bow to it. To say, "Thank you, dear life, for being so heartbreakingly, tenderly temporary." And when we do this, we discover that impermanence is not something to be feared. It is the very ground on which love, compassion, and joy are born. One evening, Robert wrote in his journal, "I used to think purpose was something I had to build. Now I see it's something I have to notice. It's the way I pour my coffee, the way I listen, the way I let myself be touched by the fragile beauty of it all." In the next part of his journey, Robert will learn how even the smallest acts, making tea, planting flowers, offering a kind word, can become vessels of great meaning. We will explore the Buddhist teaching of small acts, great meaning, and how retirement can become the most generous season of life. Stay with us, because this may be where the heart of your own story begins to stir. It began with the simplest of things. Robert was sitting at the kitchen table one morning, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, when his wife walked in holding a small potted plant. "The neighbor's boy was selling these for his school fundraiser," she said, setting the little pot down on the table. "I thought we could plant it in the back garden." Robert looked at the tiny green shoot. It was fragile, unassuming. Just a slip of green in dark soil. He found himself nodding. "Yeah," he murmured. "Let's do that." That afternoon, kneeling in the cool earth, Robert gently pressed the plant into the ground, his fingers working the soil, his breath slowing with each careful movement. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he felt something stir inside, a quiet, steady warmth. Not excitement, not purpose in the big dramatic sense, but presence. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that dana, or generosity, is one of the most profound paths to meaning. But dana is not limited to money or grand gestures. It is the simple, everyday offering of our presence, our care, our attention. It is the smile you give the stranger at the market, the kind word you speak to someone struggling, the meal you prepare with tenderness, even when no one is watching, the garden you tend, not for show, but because it brings quiet beauty into the world. Robert began to notice something. As the days unfolded, the small acts of his life began to feel less like filler and more like practice. He found himself listening, truly listening, when his wife spoke about her day, even when the details seemed small or repetitive. He paused on his morning walks to greet neighbors, offering a few words, a warm nod, a gentle moment of connection. He made a habit of stopping by the local park where a few elderly men gathered on benches to play chess. He didn't know their names. He didn't play chess, but he began bringing them a thermos of coffee just to share. At first they looked at him with mild surprise, but soon they welcomed him with small smiles, nods, quiet words. No one asked who he used to be. No one needed to. One afternoon, Robert volunteered at the local community garden. He arrived early, unsure of what to expect. There, he met a group of people from all walks of life: young parents with children, retirees like himself, immigrants tending unfamiliar crops, students seeking volunteer hours. Together, they weeded, watered, harvested, shared stories. As Robert knelt in the dirt beside an elderly woman from Vietnam, he felt a quiet awe. They spoke few words, but the woman's eyes crinkled with joy as she handed him a freshly picked tomato warm from the sun. Robert held it in his palm, felt its weight, and thought, "This is enough. This is purpose." Buddhist teachings remind us that we often chase great meaning while missing the small invitations to serve. We imagine purpose as a grand narrative, a legacy, a contribution that will be remembered. But real meaning often arises in the places we least expect. In holding the hand of a friend, in helping a neighbor carry groceries, in sitting quietly with someone in pain. These small acts become paramai, perfections of the heart. They soften our ego, open our compassion, awaken our natural generosity. At home, Robert found himself drawn more deeply into simple rituals. He swept the porch each morning, feeling the rhythm of the broom against the wood. He learned to cook a few favorite dishes, surprising his wife with dinner. He called his daughter just to hear her voice, not to offer advice. And when his granddaughter visited, he let go of his phone, his distractions, his thoughts, and entered fully into her world of giggles and games and make-believe. He became, in Buddhist language, a bodhisattva in ordinary life, a quiet presence of care, awakening joy not by doing something extraordinary, but by being extraordinarily present in the ordinary. One evening, as Robert sat on the porch watching the sky darken, his wife joined him with 2 cups of tea. She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled softly. "You seem more at peace lately," she said. Robert exhaled, a slow, quiet breath. "I think," he murmured, "I stopped looking for some big answer." She raised an eyebrow, curious. And I started noticing," he said, gazing at the soft glow of the porch light, the silhouette of the trees, the hush of the evening air, noticing what's already here. They sat together in the fading light, not needing to fill the silence. Buddhist wisdom tells us that small acts are not small. They are the threads that weave the fabric of a meaningful life. They remind us that presence is the greatest gift we can offer, and in offering it, we are transformed, not into someone new, but into someone fully awake to the life we already have. Robert began writing short notes in his journal each night. Not long reflections, just a word, a phrase, a memory. Laughed with Emily today. Coffee with the chessmen. Planted 2 rows of carrots. Held Mark's hand. Watched the moon rise. Each note was a quiet prayer, a way of saying, "I was here." I was here. I paid attention. I loved in my own small way. One day, Mark's daughter called. Her father had passed peacefully in his sleep. Robert hung up the phone and sat very still. Then he rose, walked to the kitchen, poured 2 cups of coffee, and carried one outside. He sat on the porch with both cups beside him. He watched the morning light spill across the lawn. And he whispered, quietly, "Thank you, old friend." Buddhist teachings remind us that purpose is not something we find once and hold on to. It is something we practice, moment by moment, in the way we show up to life. It is in the way we touch the earth, in the way we touch each other's hearts, in the way we let the small moments matter. In the next part of Robert's journey, we will follow him as he learns the art of letting go, not as loss, but as freedom. We will explore the Buddhist practice of release and how shedding old attachments makes space for joy. Stay with us, because the letting go may become the moment your own heart begins to fly. It started with a closet. One rainy afternoon, Robert opened the old cedar closet in his bedroom, the one he had been avoiding for years. Inside were the remnants of his former life. Pressed suits and ties, polished shoes, stacks of papers from work he no longer needed, photos from retirement parties, thank you cards, awards. For a long time he just stood there, fingers grazing the hangers, heart tight in his chest. Each item whispered to him, "This was you." But slowly a deeper voice began to rise. The voice Buddhist wisdom calls the witness, the quiet observer beneath identity. And it asked, "Is this still you? Or is this just what you're holding on to because you're afraid to let go?" In Buddhist teaching, letting go is not about rejection or denial. It's about recognizing what no longer serves the heart, what no longer brings aliveness, and gently releasing it, not with anger, but with gratitude. It's the art of freeing space so that something new, something unknown, can come alive. Robert took a deep breath and began. He folded the suits carefully, pausing at each one to remember the man he had been, not to cling to him, not to mourn him, but to honor him. He placed the shoes in a box for donation, whispering quietly, "Thank you for carrying me through so many miles." He sorted through the papers, letting go of old achievements, old roles. By evening, the closet stood nearly empty, and Robert stood before it strangely lighter, not because he had erased the past, but because he had made room for the present. The next morning, Robert took a walk in the rain. He noticed the way the trees released their leaves without struggle, the way the river moved effortlessly around rocks, reshaping itself moment by moment. He thought of the old Buddhist image of a lotus blooming in muddy water, how beauty arises not from clinging, but from surrender. Letting go, he discovered, wasn't just about objects. It was about habits, roles, even relationships. Robert had always been the one who offered advice, fixed problems, took charge. But now, he began to experiment with softening. When his daughter called, venting about work, he listened without solving. When his wife made a decision he would have made, he smiled and supported her choice. When his granddaughter wanted to show him the same magic trick for the 5th time, he watched with fresh eyes, letting go of his need for novelty. Buddhist wisdom calls this dhyana of presence, the gift of letting go of control, of certainty, of ego, and offering the spaciousness of simply being with another. In letting go, Robert found he could love more freely, not as the fixer, not as the authority, but as the witness, the companion, the gentle, quiet presence. One afternoon, as Robert sat on the porch, his wife joined him with a soft sigh. "I've been holding on to a lot too. Old worries, old roles. Maybe it's time we both let some of it go." Robert smiled, a tender warmth rising in his chest. "Maybe it is," he said softly. Together, they sat in the hush of the afternoon, two people practicing the sacred art of release. Buddhist teaching reminds us, letting go is not giving up, it is giving over to life as it is, to love as it wants to move through us, to change as it naturally unfolds. When we unclench our fists, we find our hands free to hold what matters. Robert began small rituals of release. He pruned the old rosebush in the garden, clearing dead branches so new buds could form. He cleaned his inbox, letting go of old obligations, old noise. He even cleared his calendar, making space for quiet mornings, long walks, unhurried afternoons. And in that empty space, something unexpected arrived. Peace. Not the peace of everything being perfect, but the peace of no longer clinging. One morning, Robert visited Mark's grave. The loss was still fresh, the ache still tender. But as he stood there, a soft breeze lifting the edge of his coat, he felt something shift inside. He placed his hand gently on the stone and whispered, "Thank you for walking part of the road with me." And then, with a quiet breath, he let go, not of love, not of memory, but of the grasping, the tightness, the need to hold on so hard it hurt. He walked home under a wide open sky, feeling the bittersweet freedom of a heart learning how to stay soft in the face of change. Buddhist masters remind us, you only lose what you cling to, and when you release the grip, what's meant to remain will stay, not as a possession, but as a gift. Back home, Robert found himself humming as he washed dishes. He found himself dancing, just a little, in the kitchen. He found himself laughing when his wife teased him, not bristling, not correcting. He found himself watching the evening sky with quiet wonder. This, he realized, was the gift of letting go. Not emptiness, but space. Space for joy, space for connection, space for life. As we move into the next part of Robert's journey, we'll explore how, once we've made space, joy begins to bloom, not as something we chase, but as something that finds us. We'll look at the Buddhist practice of awakening joy and how, in the simplest moments, the deepest purpose begins to shine. Stay with us, because in the next part, we may discover that joy is not a destination, but the very nature of a heart set free. It was a morning like any other, but Robert noticed it felt different. He had no plans, no meetings, no obligation. The house was quiet, except for the soft tick of the kitchen clock, and yet, as he stood at the window watching the sun rise slowly over the trees, he felt something unexpected bubbling inside him. Not excitement, not the old drive to achieve or accomplish, but something simpler, something gentler, joy. Joy. Buddhist wisdom teaches that mudita, sympathetic joy, is the ability to delight in life's simple gifts, in the happiness of others, and in the quiet beauty woven through ordinary moments. It's a joy that doesn't depend on achievement or recognition. It's a joy that arises when we let go of clinging and allow the heart to rest in the present. For much of Robert's life, joy had been something to chase. A new project, a promotion, a vacation booked months in advance. But now, with space cleared by letting go, joy began arriving unannounced, unforced. He found joy in watching his granddaughter run barefoot through the yard, her laughter a kind of music. He found joy in the earthy smell of the garden after rain, in the soft tremble of a flower turning toward the sun. He found joy in small conversations at the market, in the shared glance with a stranger over some tiny absurdity of life. Robert began noticing how often joy was already waiting, if only he slowed down enough to notice. He stopped rushing through his morning coffee, instead wrapping his hands around the warm mug, breathing in its aroma, letting the heat seep into his fingers. He lingered in the park after his walks, watching the way the light played on the surface of the pond, the ducks gliding like small, perfect miracles. He started humming to himself as he washed the dishes, not because everything was perfect, not because sorrow had left his life, but because joy had become something quieter, deeper, more resilient. Buddhist teachers remind us, joy does not arise when life gives us what we want. Joy arises when we are fully awake to what is. Robert began to realize that his purpose after retirement was not to create some grand second act, but to awaken to the extraordinary tenderness of ordinary life. One afternoon, as Robert sat on his porch, his neighbor's young son wandered over. The boy was holding a battered toy truck, one wheel missing. Robert bent down, smiling. "That's quite a truck you've got." The boy grinned shyly and handed it over. For the next half hour, they sat together on the porch steps, turning the truck this way and that, examining it like two small engineers on an important mission. Robert felt a lightness in his chest, a quiet bubbling up of happiness. He realized this was joy, not in fixing the truck, not in teaching the boy a lesson, but in simply being there, heart open, curiosity alive. As days passed, Robert found his capacity for joy deepening. He visited Mark's family not to offer wisdom or comfort, but simply to sit with them, to listen, to share a meal. He attended his granddaughter's school play, laughing at her exaggerated bow, feeling his chest swell with pride, not for her performance, but for her pure, unself-conscious delight. He began waking early to watch the sunrise, not as a task, but as a kind of communion. Buddhist practice calls this appreciative attention, a way of tuning the heart to the frequency of wonder. It is the practice of pausing, of softening, of letting ourselves be touched by beauty without needing to possess or improve it. One evening, Robert sat with his wife on the porch as twilight fell. Fireflies danced across the lawn. A hush settled between them, not empty, but full. Robert reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. For a long time they sat there, watching the stars emerge one by one, and Robert thought to himself, "This is it. This is the point of everything I was so busy chasing. To be here, to love, to let the moment be enough." Buddhist wisdom teaches that joy, when awakened, becomes a source of generosity. It spills over. It lights up those around us. It becomes a kind of quiet revolution in a world so often rushed, distracted, restless. Robert's children began noticing, "You seem Different, Dad, his son remarked one evening. Calmer, lighter. Robert smiled softly. I think I finally stopped trying to fix everything, he said. I just let myself enjoy what's here. Joy, Robert discovered, was not a reward for having figured life out. It was the natural state of a heart no longer tangled in striving. It was what rose to the surface when he stopped gripping life so tightly. It was what waited beneath the noise when he became still. He began to see joy even in moments of sorrow, in sitting quietly with his wife as they remembered old friends, in holding his granddaughter when she cried over a scraped knee, in watching the seasons turn, feeling both the ache of time passing and the sweetness of being here to witness it. Buddhist teachers tell us, when the heart opens, joy flows in. When the heart softens, love flows out. And Robert, now in this new season of life, was learning both. In the next part of Robert's journey, we will follow him as he deepens into the practice of embracing the present fully, not as a way of escaping the past or the future, but as a radical act of freedom and belonging. We will explore how the present moment, fully received, becomes the doorway to the deepest peace. Stay with us, because what comes next may be the moment where your own life quietly begins to glow from within. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of day Robert once would have called ordinary. The sunlight came gently through the window, brushing across the floor like a soft hand. Outside, a neighborhood stirred, a dog barking, a car engine rumbling to life, a faint chime of wind in the trees. Robert sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, fingers lightly wrapped around the warm cup, and for once he wasn't thinking about yesterday, or tomorrow, or even the next hour. He was just here, fully here. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that the present moment is the only true home we have, not the past heavy with memory, not the future shimmering with hope or anxiety, but this moment, this breath, this beating of the heart. And it took Robert nearly 70 years to realize. The treasure he had been searching for his whole life was not out there. It was already in his hands. He remembered a time when the present had felt like something to escape. He had been always in motion, planning, striving, worrying, fixing. Even in retirement, he had filled his days with distractions, afraid of the quiet, afraid of what he might find in stillness. But little by little, life had been teaching him. The Buddhist teachings he had stumbled upon were not abstract philosophies. They were instructions, invitations, reminders. Sit down, breathe, look around, feel your life. Robert began small practices of presence. In the morning, he stood barefoot in the garden, feeling the cool dew on the grass. When he washed dishes, he let his hands linger in the warm water, noticing the slipperiness of soap, the clink of plates, the light catching on bubbles. When his granddaughter laughed, he let the sound ripple through him like music, without rushing to capture it, without worrying when it would end. When grief arose, missing Mark, missing his younger days, missing old versions of himself, he let the sorrow pass through like a rain shower, without trying to cover it or push it away. Buddhist Master Thich Nhat Hanh teaches, the present moment is filled with joy and happiness. If you are attentive, you will see it. Robert now saw it everywhere. In the smell of baking bread from the kitchen, in the feel of his wife's hand in his, in the rustle of leaves outside his window. He had spent so many years imagining that meaning was something he would arrive at, some final destination, some grand realization. But now he understood. Meaning was not a mountaintop to reach. It was the ground beneath his feet. One evening, Robert and his wife walked to the park. The air was cool, the trees glowing gold and amber in the fading light. They sat on a bench, watching children play, couples stroll, old friends chat softly under the trees. For a long time they sat in silence. And then his wife spoke, her voice quiet. "Do you ever think," she said, "that we spend half our lives running from the very thing we were meant to discover?" Robert smiled softly. "Yes," he murmured, "I think we do." And then, without needing to explain, they simply sat, shoulder to shoulder, hearts resting in the hush of dusk. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that the miracle is not walking on water. It's walking on the earth with awareness. It's drinking your tea with both hands. It's listening with your whole heart. It's touching this fleeting, fragile world with reverence. Robert began to understand that to embrace the present fully was not to live without sorrow or regret. It was to live with them, to carry them lightly, to let them shape him without hardening him, to let life leave its fingerprints on his heart, and still keep that heart soft, open, alive. One morning Robert visited Mark's grave again. This time he brought no words, no flowers, no offerings. He simply sat on the grass, feeling the sun on his face, the breeze in his hair. He closed his eyes and whispered inwardly, "Thank you for every moment, for every lesson, for the gift of being here." As the seasons turned, Robert's children and grandchildren gathered more often. He laughed more easily now, danced in the kitchen when no one was looking, told stories without needing to impress. He became, in the eyes of those who loved him, a man who had ripened, not into someone perfect, but into someone present. Buddhist wisdom says, "You cannot stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." Robert had learned not to control life, not to solve it, but to ride its waves with grace, to meet each moment as it came, to bow to joy and sorrow alike, to live with a heart unclenched. On the last evening of autumn, Robert and his wife stood on the porch watching the sky burn gold and pink. He took her hand, pressing it gently to his chest, and in a quiet voice filled with wonder, he said, "It's all here, isn't it? All of it?" "Right here." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Ice," she whispered. And together they stood, two small figures under the vast sky, completely at home in the present moment. If you are listening now, perhaps you feel it, the longing to come home, not to some perfect life, but to the life that is already here, to your breath, to your body, to the quiet miracle of simply being alive. This is the invitation of Buddhist wisdom, not to become someone new, but to remember who you have been all along, a luminous presence, a tender heart, a fleeting, precious moment. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings, and let us continue walking together. One breath, one moment, one healing at a time. Until we meet again, may you be held in the peace that lives within you, waiting, always for you to arrive. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story touched even a small corner of your heart, I invite you to subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings. Together we will keep walking the path of Buddhist wisdom, exploring how to live, how to love, how to let go. One breath, one moment, one quiet awakening at a time. Until next time, may you rest gently inside your own heart, knowing that peace is not something you chase, but something waiting within you, always ready to welcome you home.